This is the first of 4 sessions, basically running throughout ESIP. So we're going to do introductions. Then Ethan will do a summary of the workshop from last year, and then Daniel's going to give basically the talk about the governance. And we're having a dinner at Harmon Restaurant tonight at 7 o'clock. If you, I made reservations under netCDF. If anyone's welcome to join, I booked it for a bunch of people. It's we're here, restaurants here. There are 2 locations. Make sure you go to the one on Pacific Ave. Okay, so let's go. Let's be all official and actually do a presentation. Okay, so do we have everyone here whose name's on the slide? I'm not sure. So I'm Jessica Hausman. We have Ethan Davis. We've got Garum and Daniel in the back there. There's Kevin's in the hall for some reason. We got, oh, now he's got Alex. And then David, is he here? There we go, woohoo. So if you have any questions, you can ask one of us throughout the meeting. There are also people who will be giving presentations on specific aspects that they're working on throughout the week. So you can always ask them about specifically what they're leading and working on too. So we'll also go over what the workshop goals are and the schedule for the week. So if anyone here is not familiar with what netCDF-CF is, I'm hoping you are at least familiar with what netCDF is, which is basically one of these self-describing data formats or data files. And so we're adding the climate forecast metadata extension to it. So basically kind of improving the metadata within netCDF by using a very common Earth observing metadata convention. So this is actually part of NSF EarthQ project. Started back in 2013 and you've made progress. So, so this is basically all the little projects that have been going on to help bolster the netCDF standards and also help bolster the CF metadata conventions as well. So like I said before, we'll go over what the current developments are within netCDF-CF. We also want to hear from you about what you think of the progress that's being made. Is it addressing your needs or not? And then with all that feedback, kind of figure out what we're going to do for the next year. So part 1 is now, if you weren't aware. Part 2 is going to be actually tomorrow morning. It is during the ESIP plenary, so you have to decide who do you love more, us or ESIP. We'll go over the governance roles and process. Also, there's a lot of processes that happen actually on GitHub with there's a lot of issues tracking and conversations that happen in GitHub. And then discussions and the proposals from that session specifically. Then there's a second session at 10:30, basically about the recent and current proposals. So you can see up there, those are all the ones that'll be covered at 10:30 tomorrow. And then we'll continue a little bit on Wednesday at 1:30 with those UD units, the calendars, and then also what are we going to do next with netCDF-CF. So by the end of Wednesday, the workshop will conclude. Okay, and then Ethan's up next. I think. There we go. I think it just. That's your first slide.
Yeah, that's my first slide. And then there was. Yeah, I don't know why I didn't actually put a title on this slide or anything, but basically imagine it said summary of the 2018 CF workshop, netCDF-CF workshop. That's what it says there, if I had done my job properly. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the topics that we discussed and some decisions, or at least lack of objection, somewhat consensus-y agreement even. David presented the data model, the CF data model, and last year. And this is, yeah. And it kind of was agreed, I believe, that it should be included as, is this still where we are, an appendix? Yeah, as an appendix in the conventions document. So that's, I believe, all right. Moving forward, is there a PR that puts it in there? Okay, so there's a PR, and maybe it's been agreed, but maybe not merged yet, or maybe it has anyway, hasn't been merged. So basically, and whenever there's a proposal to add to or change the CF convention, it would require that proposal indicate how it deals with the, how it interacts with the data model. If it fits into the existing data model, if it needs some tweaks of itself or the data model, or, well, I guess of the data model, and then how that would move forward. So, so that one's moved forward. So there was kind of agreement there and decision, and it has moved forward. There's a PR that needs to be merged in and stuff in the GitHub repo, and that just in case anybody, is everybody fairly familiar with CF? I mean, involved, or anybody who has never really, what is CF? Anyway, so CF is going through a transition from this old track ticket system to GitHub repos and GitHub issues. And so it's still kind of evolving in that direction and hasn't quite got there. So some things have been not advancing as quickly as they could, even though it's kind of been agreed on certain things. So there's a PR, it needs to be merged once we figure out how that all happens and such. Or so that one is kind of a decision that is made last year and has moved forward. DOIs for CF. So this is the kind of a DOI for citing. If you want to cite CF, the project of CF or the conventions, not necessarily a specific version of the document or a particular document, but CF at large. So kind of what would be represented by the cfconventions.org website, I would say. That would be like the landing page for this DOI. We all kind of agreed that's probably a good idea. That would be an easy first step, and and that we needed to write some guidance on how you would use that DOI to cite CF and blah, blah, blah. Well, that hasn't actually moved forward. So, I mean, part of it is various organizations have ways of minting DOIs, and we just haven't decided how to do it. And we haven't had anybody who is like, I'm going to make this happen today or tomorrow or this month. So it's kind of lagged a little bit, but that was kind of, I would say, does everybody agree that it was agreed on? Yeah, I'll just wander around. Here we go.
I think the step that we stopped was to define the roles for the DOI. So I suggested some attributes on the GitHub. And one thing that I could not do is just define what are the roles and the names. I think this is the technical thing that's really missing. The rest just details.
Right, I remember now. So we just basically nobody said, here are the people who developed CF, or are the, I mean, and what their roles were. So yes, that was, I forgot about that part. Okay, so that kind of stopped at that point when we got that far, and but it needs to progress, and we just haven't quite got there. So, okay, next topic, external standards. Right, so this is, there was some discussion of UGrid and SGrid and how they fit with CFs. UGrid has definitely worked really hard to make sure it is compatible with CF and in the spirit of CF, so using kind of the style of CF, and but it's going to remain a separate convention with potentially with its own versions, and we just have to figure out how to link the two and reference the two across the CF convention and UGrid. So there was going to be some discussion. I know Rich Signal's here at ESIP, so he might have some thoughts or know if there was any other conversations on the UGrid side about this. So again, general agreement that it should move forward, and some basic ideas on how, but needing to work out the details. So, okay. Next topic, external variables. Right, so it was proposed that CF should extend external variables beyond just currently you can have cell mappings. That's the only thing that has a way of referencing an external variable. So it was proposed and then agreed that other things should be added to that. For instance, geolocating variables and stuff. So coordinates like two-dimensional lat longs, perhaps, formula terms, grid mapping stuff. So, and that also has not had a champion pushing for any particular part of that, so it hasn't really moved forward, I believe. Is that kind of accurate? Yeah, okay. David is nodding his head. So yes, right. We also talked about strings, and netCDF-3 has character arrays. netCDF-4 has strings, and the current language in the CF convention is a little confusing because it talks about strings, but it means arrays of characters because that's what was there when it was written. And so it's a little, now that there are strings, it's really confusing in some ways. But basically, CF doesn't support strings in terms of the netCDF-4 string type variable. And that is something that we would like to look at and clarify the language and make sure we're consistent and say, when we say a string in CF, what does it mean if you're in netCDF-3? And when we say string in and you're using netCDF-4, what does that mean? So just need to clarify that, and that has not moved forward as well either. So no, there has been some discussion, and there's an issue on GitHub and such. Somebody have a question? We did have a very long discussion about it, yes, but it just hasn't, no concrete proposal has been formulated and written up and proposed, I believe. Some harsh language was exchanged. No, there was some language, yes. I'm going to pass this around, so.
We did put together at least some trials at like verbiage for the CF document, and I think maybe in the conformance document, I don't remember for sure, but it wasn't completely agreed that was the good
right.
language.
That's right. There was some version you had come up with, or some group of people had come up with some proposal, and then there was discussion around that, but it wasn't really fully fleshed out. Yes.
The argument about strings. There's two issues. One is the argument about allowing strings or not. That kind of basically is the gist of the GitHub argument. But then the second part would be, if we say no, then fixing the document.
If we say no, what?
If you say no strings, fixing the document.
Well, I think, well, I don't think we're going to say no. I mean,
Currently it said no.
okay, I'm not sure about that, but Yeah.
I would say I agree with Kim. It's a no to me, seems like.
Alexander says he agrees it's a no. Currently, the way the current discussion seems to be going is no. But it's okay. So I may have missed or forgotten the last recent conversations about that. I don't see how we can say no at the end. I mean, really, strings. They're strings. All right. So there's still more discussion and work to be done there. And you know what it takes in CF is just keep going. Don't get discouraged. Keep asking, keep reminding, keep talking. Okay. So that needs more discussion, evidently. Track to GitHub, we're in the middle of that. Yes, we all agreed. Let's do this because track is old, GitHub's new. We're all using, we're moving things to GitHub, so we might as well use the whole framework. Need to work through the specifics. We're working on that. There's some proposals. We'll be talking about that. Well, Daniel will present a little bit about some of that in a few minutes, and then tomorrow morning we'll talk at 8:30, I believe. We'll talk about that some more. But yes, GitHub, we're moving there. Okay. Current and upcoming CF proposals. Okay, maybe these are in. Anyway, okay, we had a number of different discussions last year. Climate indices drive statistics. That there was a small group that split off and talked about that a little bit. We talked about it a little bit in the whole group, and it needs to be explored and developed and figured out, I think, is the current state of it. Jim, would you agree with that? He is nodding yes. Good, okay. Quantifying uncertainty. Ken gave an overview, I think, of the current proposal, and I guess there's been some changes since the meeting that happened in there, or not a lot, but there was some discussion, and okay. So we're looking at things, some suggestions were made, and it hasn't moved much since then, but I think it was a good discussion. It was a discussion. All right. Link to data with netCDF. We had an overview from Mark Headley. This is not just a CF thing. They're actually, that group is working in the OGC framework and has a document that they've put together for ways to include linked data and extend existing data sets to, or be able to interpret, have a way of interpreting existing data sets that weren't designed with linked data in mind, but be able to use CF and other things to build, and other things as well. So other standards. So be able to support various types of linked data referencing various conventions and whatnot. So including CF, but other things as well. So anyway, that there was no real decision because it's not really in that CF right now. So it was just discussed and presented. And yes, CF2 groups. And some of these this was discussion from last year. We'll have some more discussion on these in the next few sessions tomorrow. CF groups has, so an overview is given with some updates and work continues. So, all right, so they were going to be presenting it to a few other groups, and before it came back to CF, it has gone through that process. It's come back to CF. I think it's agreed at this point, and there's a PR to the convention document. It just hasn't been, it's been approved, but it hasn't been merged, I believe. Okay. CF radial. We had an overview of version 1.4, which has been around for a while, and 2.0, and where that stands. There was some discussion of the CF-ness of it, or lack thereof. There's some things that are less in the style of CF, like it actually defines variable names, I think, so it's not really attribute based as exclusively like CF is. And there was then question about the CF, how it fits with the CF data model, and that's still kind of up in the air. And it's, I think that was, did I mention that in the last earlier conversation about external? No, I was just talking about UGrid as an external convention, and CF radial may fall into that camp as well. Okay, so that was more of just an overview and update. Satellite swath is also coming along.
There is only one issue to resolve, is whether or not it's going to be an incoming, or so it can produce, so I can produce an appendix to the convention, or we have to first modify the convention.
Right, right. So last year it was kind of in line with the group's discussion, and there was some follow-up that was going to happen. There's still, so some of that has happened. Groups has been approved, I think, but satellite swath is, there's a few issues still coming up with.
The issue with satellite swath was that, so the issue with this proposal was that the last workshop, because it introduces about, forgot, maybe 6, 7, or 8 different types of swath variables. So the people said, well, maybe we need to have a hint as an attribute and use the one called feature type. So that now every variable has a feature type that says, well, this is the type of swath that this is. And that would require that CF convention has been changed, because right now feature type is a global attribute only.
Ah, right.
And so, but I haven't pushed that because there are other things I think more interesting to follow. So the question is, are we going to follow this, or we say, no, that's not really important? Because then if it's not important, then the whole proposal can just be turned into an appendix with maybe some text added for coordinates, because it introduces the notion of spectral coordinate. It's not any more pressure, time, let alone stuff like that.
Right. Okay. So.
Thanks. There was also the issue of the coordinates. So if you have fields of regard that contain fields of views, we discussed whether or not we need coordinates for every field of view within the field of regard, or whether we could essentially give a projection mapping for the field of regard that tells you how to reconstruct the field of views coordinates. And from my understanding of the meeting, the feeling was we don't actually need that, because all the coordinates are recoverable, which made me really happy. But on the other hand, I was rereading section 5 of the conventions, and it did give me the impression that that would require some rewording in order to keep the whole thing consistent if we allow fours that don't have coordinates for every FOV. Is that also how you remember the discussion?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so yeah, minimal work then, I guess.
Maybe some changes to the existing CF convention to go along with. Anyway, yeah, okay. Right.
Yeah, I haven't been pursuing it either, because the group's proposal is a prerequisite to some ways of encoding swaths.
Right.
And so I thought one after the other.
All right. And we also discussed governance and sustainability. Talked about regular meetings. We'll talk about that more during the Daniel's governance discussion today and tomorrow morning, because we talk about that there in his proposal as well. How to work with other communities or overlap with other communities, like we are now with ESIP. Outreach and helping new users, that came up a fair amount. And then tendency for decisions and or actions to stall. So that's, I think once we get through this switch to GitHub, that will help with that, because a lot of the, there's just a lot of points that get blocked current in the old and current process. And I think hopefully those will improve as we get the GitHub flow down. CF standard names and ontologies, we talked about that, an overview and whatnot. Mark Headley has a GitHub issue about HDF object references, adding those to the netCDF API. So currently in CF, we have a lot of attributes pointing, giving the name of a variable or various things like that. And this would be a more concrete reference. And it's kind of a bigger issue than CF, sort of. And it was discussed, but no real conclusion, I don't think, came out of that. And that's kind of the summary of last year's meeting. Just wanted to make sure we knew where we stood from last year. And we had some updates over what happened then, just in that conversation, but we can go through some of these again in the next few days and talk about them. So, all right, any questions, or we can jump right to Daniel's talk on governance. Any questions, objections, revisions, other opinions? Okay, just try and, oh, there we go, okay.
So about the DOI for the CF on the roles, how can we resolve that? Yeah, we just need the names, right? And to find the names and the roles and.
Right.
So there is a new, what are we calling? Research object citation group now in ESIP. So basically the data citation and the software citation we merge together. And so CF would actually be a really good example of a research object. So how do you get the DOIs inside it and all that stuff? So that's.
So maybe we're not talking the same thing, not the data, about the CF itself.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
The conventions.
Right. So you want a DOI for the convention.
Yes.
So the convention is a research object. So that's like ontologies. How do you cite as an ontology? So how do you cite a convention? So this is one of the things we're working on. So yeah, just complain to us and then we're like, oh, okay. But no, we're trying to figure out how to do these types of things too. So don't let it die.
Yeah, we should definitely get that figured out. And yeah, I don't know. I forget where that discussion ended. It kind of did peter out, but maybe there was something we can build on from there. All right, Daniel. Moving on to governance and process. Uh-oh. There we go.
What is it? Oh, thanks.
It was in presenter mode, which is what online.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Lee. I'm from UMetSat. And to give a short, well, I'm going to be talking today about discussions that have been surrounding the CF governance process and also its implementation in GitHub. And this might actually stratify into two separate discussions that are interlinked, but are not strictly speaking the same thing. And what I'm not going to be doing today is try to go through all of the nuances of what's been proposed. And the reason for that is because we have some time devoted to that tomorrow, and I don't want to bore you for too long. But a goal for me of this workshop would be, if we find that the issues that we've been discussing in emails and via documents that have been proposed and sent around, and now in a GitHub issue, if you as other members of the community are also interested in this stuff, then it would be cool to band together and then produce a mature proposal that might be adopted in order to augment the governance process. Now, what's my interest here? I don't normally care about procedural governance stuff because it's pretty boring. So sorry, this is going to be pretty boring. I am sent to interact with the CF community on behalf of UMetSat, on behalf of CGMS. That's a coordinating group on meteorological satellites. And there we have certain features that it would be very useful to have implemented in netCDF-CF. And the question that CGMS is always asking us is, okay, well, have you talked to the CF community about this? Yes. Is there interest in adopting, for example, the use of groups? Yes, there is. Okay. Now it's been adopted. When's it going to come into the next version of the standard? When can we start using this and start implementing against it? Because satellite people really care about baselines and not having them shift. So they're wanting to always wait to implement something that goes into an operational ground segment until there's an actual published version of some document that they can bind a contractor to. So the fact that things can sometimes stall and get delayed and stuff creates difficulties that are perhaps specific to my community. So this may be even more interesting for me than it is for you. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to show what we've been talking about in a fairly approachable manner. So we have people that are noting that it can be difficult to implement changes that are needed to the conventions. And of course, everybody wants to keep the standard alive and up to date with our current needs. And like I said, remote sensing users, remote sensing data producers feel this especially strongly because if we want to use something, generally we need it to be set in stone and guarded by immortal guardians and, you know, flashing swords of fire several years before it's actually useful to us, just because our implementation baselines are so waterfally and fairly stiff. And thus, I think, yeah, thus was begun a discussion that has involved a lot of people that are in the room today. Guillaume, David, Jonathan Gregory, who sadly is not here this week, but he'll be attending remotely tomorrow. And he's given a lot of really useful input into this. Also Ethan, Martin, who will also be participating remotely tomorrow, and myself. And then there have been other people who have expressed interest in this, but haven't contributed a lot to the discussion around it. So I'm not listing them individually. And maybe there are other people who I haven't mentioned because you haven't been involved, but you might be interested in improving our processes within the community. And I'd be really happy to hear what you think. What are the main issues that we've been talking about? Well, implementing changes is slow. That can be a good thing. It can also be a frustrating thing. When it's frustrating, then of course we'd like opportunities to change that. And so reasons that implementing changes is slow have been that there's not always moderators available to discuss proposals. Sometimes the process isn't really clear, so it's not clear who needs to be involved in what stage of what process. This is formulated perhaps unfairly because a lot of times it is clear, you just have to know where to find the information. And as we migrate to GitHub, places where you would instinctively look to find this information in a GitHub project don't contain the information yet. So here we see the need for procedural updates that don't necessarily touch directly the governance process or the governing bodies. And something that I've noticed continually when you look at presentations about CF or documents about CF is some phrase that goes along the lines, we're all volunteers and we do this in our free time and we don't have a lot of resources. And if we had more effort, more person hours that we can contribute, then we could move things a lot faster. And I feel this at UMetSat as well. It's hard to get my employer to commit my time to working on standards unless it's clear what portion of me is getting committed. So if it's my leg from the knee down, I could probably swing that for a year. But if it's going to be up to the hip, then I'll have more trouble justifying that. And because there aren't really clear, there isn't clear information about what it would mean to be a part of specific committees, for example, that might be a barrier for employers allocating employees to contribute to the efforts at CF. And this is also noted in the documentation that you can find online going back to, I think, 2003. And if you have an employer who gives you lots of freedom, then it's not a problem. And okay, and there are some known items that should be better documented. For example, when changes are approved, when do they actually get merged into the convention's documents? When a new version is released, who approves them, how do they get approved, who pushes the button. Some of this, like I said, is known within the community. It's just not noted down somewhere. And some of these items are noted down in track tickets. So if you know the track ticket that you're looking up, then you can find the information. But it would probably be better to move it to a more central document, would be my opinion. So when you sit down and start musing about the causes of this, if these things are annoying us, then what would we need to attack in order to stop them from annoying us? Well, first of all, the governance processes themselves aren't bad. In fact, they're mostly pretty well defined, but we do see that there are bottlenecks, for example, in finding moderators to moderate discussions, or in finding somebody who can close the loop on something that's just been kind of discussed for a long time, but nobody takes a decision on it. And there are barriers that might be keeping people from participating for the aforementioned reasons, those being a lack of clarity concerning the roles and responsibilities that people fulfill, how much time these roles require, and it can also be intimidating to get involved in submitting change requests because some people occupy multiple roles, so you may not know who to ask. And if you submit an issue, it may not be moderated automatically, so to speak. So an example of something that's not super clear, but is actually a fairly mature process, is the rules for updating the CF conventions. So I've got a diagram that I made. This is extracted from the free text in the rules for updating the CF conventions. And it mostly works, but it doesn't fully align with GitHub. So after the migration to GitHub, I think it deserves an update. And again, this is my interpretation of how the process works, and this is probably not correct. And if it is correct, it's not the only way to interpret that. So I put in UML, and now I'm going to wave my arms around. Is the microphone somewhere? Can I use that? Thanks. So how do I implement? Everybody can read this, of course. I can read this from here. How do you implement a change to the CF conventions? Well, starting at the second from the top swim lane, here I am a proposer of change, and I decide, there's something that needs to be done in the CF convention. So the first thing I would do in this situation, but I don't think that this is the way everybody interprets it, is put down something concrete and put that in a pull request. I think an alternative interpretation is create an issue and discuss the more high-level aspects of what you want changed, and then to create a pull request afterwards. I personally prefer having a pull request fairly early, because then people can point to a specific line and say, this sucks, this we need to change, or this we should add. It's in the slides, yeah. Thanks. Actually, so the people online can follow along. Here I'm gesticulating, and I'm going to try to put up a... Okay, I'll use the mouse. So you create a pull request or you create an issue, and there should be a moderator who volunteers. If nobody volunteers, then the committee chairman asks somebody to moderate, and then you do have a moderator. So the moderator is this row down here, and they moderate the discussion on GitHub for a while, for as long as it takes. And in my interpretation of the wording of the rules, but it's not the only interpretation, I believe, is that you need 3 weeks without contribution. So where there's kind of the discussion has died down, nobody's contributed for 3 weeks, and at that point the moderator summarizes the discussion, and then people can object to that or affirm their understanding is in line with what the moderator has said. And if 3 weeks pass thereafter and there is no more further contributions, then the proposal can be considered accepted. And that's at the discretion of the moderator and contingent on having at least 2 supporters from within the CF committee. And the whole time we've got this loop where everybody who's involved and interested and has time is contributing to the discussion on GitHub. An example of this is with the group's proposal, which has been being worked on this year. There is a pull request, there's an associated issue to talk about the high level stuff, and sometimes it's kind of mixed because things are going back and forth between the pull request. But generally, the proposal is being updated based on input from concerned parties, and at any time you can see what the changes were, how people were responding to comments, that kind of thing, until at some point consensus is considered reached. Now, I've also heard from other people that the whole 3 weeks thing is kind of stupid and maybe we don't have to use the 3 weeks. I would agree with that. But that's my interpretation of the wording of the document at the moment. And then after the proposal is accepted, the initiator provides a sample file. And if the moderator described consensus that everybody basically is happy with the proposal, then it's considered accepted. If not, then the moderator can call for a vote. And if there are less than 2 objections to the proposal being accepted, then it is accepted. But if 2 or more people object, then the proposal gets rejected. So that seems pretty straightforward. It takes a while because there has to be these periods of silence, which may also be an incorrect interpretation of the process. And there's also a bit of a lack of coverage here for update to standard documents. So that process, when do changes actually get merged into what branch, and when does that branch get tagged and released and used by people, etc. There, I don't think that there's any living documentation about that, basically due to the migration from Track to GitHub. So surely this is something that could be well defined and would be compatible with this process, but there's not been, that has not yet been implemented in GitHub. So as you can see, okay, that works, and I still feel that there is room to clarify the processes and also the roles involved in governing the CF conventions. And that would not only make things clearer and easier to navigate, but it would also make things easier. It would make it easier to share the workload, basically because for the roles, for the people who are responsible for certain things, if it's clear who they are, then they can be pinged, or they can also demur and pass it on to somebody else who can share that. And another advantage of clarifying these things, in my opinion, would be that it would augment the ability of the governing bodies, namely the CF, the governance panel, the conventions committee, and the standard name committee, to support community engagement and also to interact with other bodies. For example, WMO I know has interests in making more use of the CF conventions, but they're not sure with what frequency they should expect releases and how the peer review process works and that kind of thing, which is something that makes them nervous because WMO would like to lock down every part of any given process. Okay, I've been talking for a long time now, so is there any thoughts that people have been holding back while I'm dancing around in front of the screen? It's muted.
So now that it's in GitHub, it's kind of like software, it's kind of code. When you find a typo, a bunch of typos in the document, should we treat that as a different process since it's a more simple resolution, a simpler pull request, or do we kind of go through the whole process for a simple typo?
There has been some work on getting the contributing.md file up to spec. There's been quite a bit of work there actually, and some of the more recent discussions have split the change requests into different categories. So actually, do I have I'm sure I got a web browser on here. Don't want to say the wrong thing or something that's not true. Ethan?
I think even in the old track process and in, I don't know if it's which document says, but there is a difference between I forget what they're termed in the CF documents, but what's that? A defect versus an enhancement or a proposal. So yeah, it's a lighter weight process if you find something that's just wrong.
Now I've screwed up everything because I tried to open a browser. Okay. Yeah, so for defect, it's a much lighter process. Okay. So I've written a proposal that basically addresses two topics. Topic number one is governance bodies, and topic number two are procedural changes, basically for interacting with GitHub. And the meat of these are that for the governance bodies, I'm proposing that they have specific terms of reference and that the composition, number, and length of membership should be concretely set forth. Now, this is kind of a big change, and for me as a complete outsider to CF, it was kind of intimidating to propose. I've been really happy to have a lot of interactions, especially with Jonathan about this, talk about what impact this would have and whether it would be beneficial. The motivation for limiting, so basically what I'm proposing is limiting how many people are in each body so that each body is able to make decisions if it comes down to it, and limiting the time that people serve in these bodies would have, in my mind, the advantage that that people would be opting in to being a member of them. So I'm not wanting to kick people out after a certain amount of time, but I do think it would be beneficial for people to decide to basically renew their membership in a given body, and for example, in the conventions committee, rather than automatically staying forever. And the other parts of the proposal as it stands right now are basically adding some language about what exactly the different bodies do and what the two named offices within those bodies do, namely the chair and the secretary, defining that a little bit more specifically. Concerning procedural changes or changes to the procedures, I've proposed having a set frequency of new releases. So if there are changes that have been merged into, let's say, the development branch of the repository, that would be released with a certain frequency. If there's no need to make a new release, then it wouldn't happen. And I've proposed 1 year, but apparently there is also a decision somewhat recently that's documented in Track to do this every 6 months. I don't think that that's actually current practice, though. And then having a comprehensive implementation of all the processes for changing the documents on GitHub, document the contributing.md file, and also consolidating a little bit what we have on GitHub. So for example, right now, to go back to the diagram from beforehand, something I'm not showing in this diagram is the necessary updates to the governance, or not to the governance, to the conformance document. So if you change the standard, you need to also update the conformance document, and that gets rather complex because the conformance document currently is housed in a different repository. So I would propose consolidating repositories, consolidating documents into repositories based on who is responsible for that group of documents, rather than having per document repositories. And what I have not touched in my proposal at all is the standard name table and any governance of the standard name table, basically because I don't know how that's done. But the release frequency is fairly high, so it seems to be working very well, so I see no reason to touch that. I haven't heard from anybody that things are getting really tied up in there. If you're interested in taking a look at what's been proposed, you can see the original proposal that was circulated as a Google Doc that's linked to my presentation. That was just a proposal for initial discussion, so I was trying to get everybody to write into it and comment on things, and that has evolved quite a bit based on discussions that we had there and also via email. And at a certain point, the discussion had just gotten complex enough that tracking it in the comments was no longer going to do justice to all the concerns that people had. And so now I've created an issue on GitHub with a corresponding pull request. This pull request is not meant to be pulled. It's just meant to freeze the state of the documents and make it easier to see who said what about what and when. So it's simply for better traceability. And when it's mature enough, then it might actually be submitted as an actual formal pull request. That would be contingent on the approval of the governance panel. And this also might be split into 2 items. The pull request as it stands contains, I believe, 3 files. One is the transcription of the rules for making changes to the CF conventions that was done by Jonathan. Another one is a modified version of that where Jonathan introduced changes that had been coming from my Google Doc. And a third one is a frozen version of my Google Doc. And I will be cleaning this up in the course of the next few weeks. So but I wanted to have a good basis for discussion so that everybody who's here can look at that. If you want to contribute to the discussion right now, you can see a frozen state of everything as it's been done, and not have to refer to different emails and things and get really confused. So my goal from this would be to, well, tomorrow I'll be showing a little bit, I'll be showing a summary of what is on the table with these proposals. That'll go slightly more in depth than I've gone today. And I would be happy if we could collect from the people present and those participating remotely and those participating via email, the priorities and any objections or endorsements of the things in those proportions in the proposal. And then if there's enough interest to actually make this thing happen, then to put together a project team that within, depending on how many people and what the interests and availabilities are, I would say within 6 months would prepare a mature proposal that could then be adopted by the governance panel. And I think that's, yeah, that's that. Super interesting, right? Still got a little timer. No, good. I used up the time. No discussion.
No, you were supposed to start now. Yeah, we have another half hour.
So I just want to clarify, this is just to change the conventions of CF. This has nothing to do with the standard names.
Right. Standard names, I've
Have
got
a
no
whole
clue about
different
them.
thing, yeah. Okay.
And they're a totally different thing. Although one of the modifications that was proposed by Jonathan was to combine the conventions and the standard name committees. I don't feel qualified to comment on that. He has a lot more experience, so I've adopted that as part of the proposal.
Yeah, right now the standard names is you write an email to the group and then they discuss. And then they discuss some more and
Yeah.
some more.
Yeah, I think I have a filter for that in Outlook.
I mean, so I'm pretty new to the standard name part of it and everything really. But like, it was intimidating at first to like just even email. But as soon as like that happened, a discussion happens, and then like whenever I think Allison like minced the new lists, like my name was in there. So like, and it seemed to work pretty well. And from what I've seen, like on that list, like they might not be interested in touching GitHub at all. Like there's a lot of old school scientists, let's put it that way, that like the way they're doing things and kind of want to keep it that way.
Yeah, I mean, if it works, I don't see a reason to change it just because I love GitHub. So.
Yeah, so one of the big issues I find with the list as it's set up right now is it's it's almost impossible to search for things that have been going on. So like I've downloaded the archives and grepped through them to try to find out if there's been some discussion about whatever it is I'm about to ask. So that needs to be addressed, but maybe not. There's resistance to GitHub.
Okay.
Like,
Well, my feeling is, you know, I've just been involved in CF as a participant, not as a mere user for, I guess, like 2 years now. And so proposing changes like, you know, those committees that have been running CF for years and have been doing a great job, let's kick people out of them after a certain number of years. You know, I felt very, very cautious about proposing that kind of stuff. I'm trying to, for my purposes, I would like to be as surgical as possible. Also because I think that promotes continuing to have a strong community feeling to it. But sure, I mean, if you think that there's a room to improve the management of the standard names, then we could try to bundle that in.
I think part of the problem too is it's just, it's not clear or advertised very well where you can find some of the discussion. I mean, the discussion is all on the email, but there's other places, like there's a web interface to a big database of when things were proposed and what was proposed and how it changed, which is not, I've only stumbled on it every so often and then forget about it, so.
every once in a while.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to find. So I think some clarification about, and this is a separate topic from what we've been talking about, but I think the standard names could use with at least some clarification of, or improvement on the location or findability of the documentation of how the process works, what the, you know, how things are structured, the modifiers, all that infrastructure around how standard names are developed, which Jonathan and Allison and other people just know all this stuff, and those of us new to it, it's a little unclear why we do it a certain way or why they make certain suggestions, or. But yes, I agree. That's a different discussion than this one, and I think, but I mean, it's related, but it needs to have a different group working on it, or at least other people involved. You know, Allison and Jonathan definitely need to be in that discussion. So, any other thoughts?
So the basics is that you find a moderator. It's okay. So that's okay.
Because the online people too.
Sorry. Yes. All right. But the basis of this proposal is that there is going to be a moderator. No problem. Is that, you know, what we're expecting? There is going to be a moderator willing to take up this issue.
Well, a moderator has been part of the process for a long time. It's just whether we've actually had a moderator step up or be assigned. So yes, I think that's part of it, is let's make sure that a moderator is found for each issue instead of it just kind of left to float for a while or whatever.
And is there any possibility that we say if there is no moderator within 6 months, then what? For whatever the reason.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm proposing having set spans of time where you are a member of a specific committee, and then collecting data on how much time you have to invest, is so that people can essentially be allocated to do work for the conventions. Because why can't you find a moderator? Is because people don't have time. So you can't have anything akin to a service level target, for example. You can't have any service level objectives if everything is purely best effort. And in the case of organizations like UMetSat and ESA, normally if you get allocated to a to be in a scientific community of any sort, or a committee of any sort, then that will be associated with a certain amount of time that you're supposed to be investing into work on that. And so that would allow us to have at least objectives that we try to hit. So like you're saying, within 6 months, there should be a moderator found. I think that that's achievable. And yeah, that's one of the intents of this proposal. If you have any concrete suggestions as to what we could put in there in order to ensure that moderators are found and are useful, then.
Well, I don't think you can, what, you put like coupons for something, or, $10 at someone if you volunteer. I mean, that's difficult to say. It also depends on the topic. Maybe there are no people thinking about being moderators that can actually actively moderate an issue. That's another thing. But in some case, you fall back on the guy who proposing it, because he obviously has the biggest pain. He wants to solve something because he's proposing. Can he become a moderator just for the sake of having someone? Of course, at the end of the day, people will have to say, do you like the whole proposal and how it looks like? But as long as you don't get stuck on, well, we don't have a moderator, then what? That first threshold, that first step into moving forward.
Yeah, so the current rules state that discussions can be moderated by a committee member or another qualified member of the community. So I think that definition could be refined. But yeah, it's not really, to me, it's not very clear who can be a moderator and under what conditions.
Well, one step further, I think it's not clear what's the job of the moderator, right? If you look on the GitHub discussions, there are different opinions about. So the first thing is what is expected from a moderator.
I'm going to make myself really popular and say I think it would be really great to model everything in UML, because then you automatically think about that stuff. Don't throw anything though yet. I find it useful because then you think, okay, who are the roles and now what are they associated with? If there's interest, we could actually go through the proposal, like through the major points.
Yeah, we have 20 minutes. I think we can talk about it.
Okay. All right. So where do you find the stuff? I'm going to go through the major points in the proposal, but I'm not going to go through the actual text because the text is evolving. Instead, I'm going to pull up my, oh no, I can't get a web browser from here, can I? Where's it? Ah, okay. Okay, so I've summarized what the current state of the discussion is. Right, thanks. Okay, so this is my summary of that. So group by pain points. I hope this isn't too small, but you can also download this and put it on your screens. Okay, so complaint. It's hard to share the workload in the governance process. Like it's hard to find moderators. That would be point number 1 that I'm trying to solve. Number 2, difficult to reach decisions. Number 3, duties of people who are involved in different tasks are unclear. And number 4, it's hard to implement things that would typically be done as projects, like migration to GitHub. A lot of work, limited scope, limited duration, hard to accomplish. These are things that I see as associated with the governance process, so not necessarily just the procedural aspects of working with GitHub. So number 1, you solve the problem of difficult workload sharing by sunsetting terms so that members opt in to being a part of the committees that they're parts of. This would have the advantage that people would be actively deciding to stay rather than just being a part automatically. Have a known mechanism for appointing or electing members. In my original proposal, I had said that members should be elected. There's also the idea that members of committees could be appointed by the governance panel. For me, it's also not clear how the governance panel's membership is, how that evolves over time. So at least having that written down and documented. And then as a secondary step, estimate the yearly effort that you can expect to invest if you're going to occupy any of these roles. Then for the issue of it being difficult to reach decisions, capping the number of people in any body. This is surely a more controversial thing, I think. I personally am of the opinion that makes a given body more able to make decisions. So I prefer having odd numbers of people in any decision-making body, but that's my personal preference. And the other thing is ensuring that the processes that need to be executed are clear and that they're seamless. Right now, I feel like we have a gap in our process documentation, which translates to a gap in responsibility for adopting proposed changes. For the complaint, duties are unclear. We'll clarify them. And there is also the suggestion to combine the conventions and standard name committees. This comes from Jonathan, so I'm not really, I can't say a lot to it. It sounds okay to me. It would simplify things maybe, but I don't really have an opinion. And where I do have an opinion is that I think that it should be clear which bodies own which documents. There is language in the original white paper that talks about the governance of the CF conventions that mentions a constitution. And this constitution would be owned by the governing panel. But there's no document that's called a constitution. So I think a constitution is a great idea. And in that case, in my opinion, that should be a document called the Constitution, and it should belong to the governing panel, so that body would have the ownership over that document and any changes to it. And the standard names would belong to the standard name committee if it's still a separate committee, and the CF conventions would belong to the CF committee. And then where it's hard to implement projects, allow for the creation of ad hoc project groups, I've called them, with a limited scope and duration, and then maintain a record of their contributions. And these groups should essentially be spawned by a given body. So for example, by the conventions, by the CF committee, in the example of migrating to GitHub, you could make a project group that would be a certain set number of people with the job, complete all the documentation for how we will work on GitHub, put that into the contributing.md files of all the repositories, set up the rights so that people know, so that the right people have the rights to write to those repositories, and make sure that everybody's briefed about it, and do this all within 6 months. For me, that would make it easier to participate in such projects, because then I could approach my employer and say, I'm going to be working on this thing, and at this point it will be over. And I think for many academics, maintaining a record of contributions would be useful, because that's something that you can refer back to and say, well, as you can see here, I did this work and it produced a result. So it's not something that kind of disappears and becomes additional workload on top of, say, doing your PhD or writing research proposals or whatever. Yeah, and that's actually all that I'm proposing as far as changes to the governance process itself are concerned. And then I have an analog for changing the procedures. I just realized that the header could be interpreted as the crying guy poking the happy guy. But I meant the crying guy becoming the happy guy. Yeah. So, okay, so there's a need to synchronize, to communicate within the community beyond this asynchronous communication that we have via email. I think that the community benefits from that, and having the having this forum right now is really, really useful, because yeah, you don't just sort it away into your CF folder and think you'll think about it later, and then you don't think about it. So that's one thing that I think we should keep, which you have right now. A difficulty that for example, UMET, CGMS, and WMO have with the CF conventions is not knowing when releases will come out. So yeah, the unclearness of the release frequency could be a pain point. Unclear processes with gaps, already talked about that, and already talked also about not having enough moderators available. So here are the magical solutions that will fix all of these things. Number one, we need to synchronize, so let's make sure that we have an annual meeting. That's not in any of the CF documents that I'm aware of, so it's a thing that's being done, which is good, and I think that we should make that part of the of just what we do. The unclear release frequency, I would propose tying that to the annual meeting, because having an annual meeting is a good way of making everybody wake up and actually look at the pull requests. And I would also propose a Git flow inspired workflow of merging in changes as they get approved, so that it's easy to see the delta between two releases before you actually press the merge button. And as far as having processes unclear or having gaps in them, I'm a big fan of UML, so I would say use UML or use free text or whatever to map all of the processes that we have them, and map also not only the conceptual processes, but their implementation in GitHub, so that it's clear how things work. That would also reveal, I think, further gaps, because when you write down how a process works, you see what's unclear about it. And like I mentioned before, I also propose that every governance body has a tree of documents that it's responsible for, and that body can decide how they want to do that. So it might be that the governance panel has different procedure for updating its constitution, fine by me. Then the CF committee might have another procedure. They might decide to share them across bodies. That would be probably a good idea, but I don't see any reason to impose that. And in order to make that really useful and navigable, it would be beneficial to have a meta repository that would include in all of the CF documentation. And then not enough moderators available. Okay, well then clarify who can be a moderator. And then very concretely, I've said create a process to ensure one is assigned in a given time. So that would be a TBD, in my opinion. And as Guillaume is saying, I think it would be beneficial also to say, to better document what exactly the role of a moderator is in these discussions. And then if we implement the changes from the previous slide, I feel that it's likely that people would have more time to, or that we would know who would have time to devote to moderating discussions. That's the gist of it. In fact, that's all of it. And the proposed implementation would be migrate the original government's description that exists on the CF website to ASCII doc, so it's really easy to see what changes are being proposed. Because right now we've got two different documents that we're just basically comparing using our minds, and I don't trust minds that much. Then complete the full governance proposal and submit that as a pull request to the appropriate people. And part of that governance proposal would be to say, these are the people that are in charge of this, these are the people who are in charge of that. So this would still be, even if the proposal contains some really wild changes, we would follow the current governance process as best as we know how. Then create or designate a root repository for all the documents and a repository for each governing body. And for anything that's not covered in the governance document at that point, so anything that's purely procedural and it's a mapping of processes onto GitHub, that would go into the contributing.md file in the appropriate repository, maybe with UML, and then we would have documentation of what we want to do. And the next step would be to actually do what we've documented and probably fix the errors that we've made when writing it down. And then I'm sure everything would be wonderful and we'd all get our own personal unicorns. I'm looking for people who want to collaborate on this. Is anybody interested? Yes, thank you, David. Ethan? Yes. Okay. Is anybody seeing things here that look stupid? Content-wise? Because this would be a really great opportunity for me to correct course if that were the case. This is like discussions at CGMS. Okay, that's a full endorsement then. Thank you very much.
All right, we're down to 5 minutes. I think that was a good wrap up. All looks, oh, yeah, hi. That seems good. Yep, good wrap up, good overview, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow. And dinner. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, and go read the, we can always go look at the issue in GitHub and the documents and some of the discussion to get a little more of the back and forth if we have time tonight, after or before dinner, which is at Harmon's on Pacific Avenue, 0.3 miles from here or so, to the south.
Yes. And in a block downhill.
Block down the hill.
Turn right.
Yeah. What's that? Oh, yeah. There we go. We're here. Oh, you can go down this way too. Where's that railroad track? Oh, no, you don't want the railroad track.
On the train. It's on the blue.
The railway track is the one, if you were to take that corner.
Commerce Street is the one where the blue dot is.
Oh, I was thinking of this little walkway right here. So yes, but there's a, you can hop that light rail or whatever it is. What? That's what I've heard, yeah. But it's not very far to walk, so 7-minute walk. And this, yeah, right. What's the vertical on this climb, right? 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock. It's under netCDF and my name, in case you can't remember. Because we all get like stare when people ask questions.
Okay.
But they have beers, and I'm sure you can show up earlier for happy hour.
Right, right. Okay, so thanks everyone. See you tomorrow morning at 8:30 in this same room. And we will just go until we, I believe it's 8:30. The plenary is at 8, but this one is set to start at 8:30. So I'm gonna, I don't know why, but it is. So, yay. Okay, thanks everyone online. Talk to you tomorrow, hopefully. Oh, do I need to turn this off or what do I do?
Pause.
Hit pause. Bye, everyone online.
So further down.
Pause. Oh, that's the